Educator Effectiveness Committee. Can we get a roll call, please?
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Volpe?
Present.
Dr. Volpe is present. Mr. Castillo?
Here.
Ms. Castillo is present. Dr. Davis?
Here.
Dr. Davis is present. Ms. Ellis? Ms. Ellis is not present. Mr. Garvey?
Here.
Mr. Garvey is present. Ms. Holloway?
Here.
Ms. Holloway is present. Mr. Mellerin?
Here.
Mr. Mellerin is present. Mr. Morris?
Here.
Mr. Morris is present. Ms. Orange Jones? Ms. Orange Jones is not present. Mr. Rock?
Present.
Mr. Rock is present. Ms. Gautier? Ms. Gautier is not present. Ms. Tedesco? Ms. Tedesco is not present. We have a quorum.
Thank you. What's our first item? Your consent agenda is ready for approval, adding items 3.1, 5.1, 5.2, and 6.2. We have a motion from Mr. Rock and a second by Mr. Morris. Is there any discussion, board members? Any objection? Hearing none, motion passes. What's our next item? Your first item is on page 1, item 2.1, consideration of a proposal for the mentor teacher training program submitted by McNeese State University. The LDE recommendation is to approve the elementary mentor teacher training program submitted by McNeese State University.
Motion.
I would entertain a motion to take these in globo. And I have that motion from Ms. Holloway, and I have a second from Mr. Mellerin. Would you like to read the others now? Yes, so we have a proposal for content leader training program submitted by Louisiana Tech University. Initial certification preparation pathway proposal submitted by Teach Tangi. Initial certification preparation pathway proposal submitted by Jefferson Parish School District. Initial certification preparation pathway proposal submitted by Teach St. Tammany. And a proposal for an innovative residency model submitted by Louisiana Tech University. Thank you very much. Superintendent, would you like to speak on this item? Okay. Board members, do you have any questions?
I do. In looking at the initial certification for Jefferson Parish and Teach Tangi, I just have questions about, as we are approving these, we've had a big emphasis on reading. How do these districts or these new teacher prep programs, how are they going to be training their teachers in reading? And then do these programs have partnerships with our four-year universities? Do you know?
Dr. Chesson, do you want to come up on this regard? Ms. Cooper?
Good morning.
Ann Cooper, Deputy Assistant Superintendent, LUE. All of the prep programs have to comply with addressing the teacher competencies. So the competencies that we added last meeting around the science of reading are for every prep provider. So all of these will also have to do that.
And do our local district teacher preparation programs and our alternative pathways, do they have a certification process beyond just BESI approval in the same way, for instance, that a four-year university has national certification?
No.
Okay. And so can someone just explain to me, because I guess these are questions that are coming to me, we've approved other teacher prep programs in the past, and so I guess I'm just curious about why we are pushing, or why districts are doing their own teacher prep programs rather than using the four-year universities. What's the advantage for them in doing that in terms of providing, us with more certified teachers that we desperately need?
I think some of them really wanted to grow their own in their own school system. So having employees in different positions who wanted to get additional certification, or even those that don't have certification, wanting to do that in-house. I think out of just convenience, they could do it at a cheaper cost, I think, than some other prep providers. But I would have to ask each one individually, what their original purpose was for doing it. But I think for the most part, it was really just to help their current school system employees.
And so our quality control on these type of prep things is through our accountability system rather than some national certification. And so our four-year universities basically have to go through a double process where they are help go through our own accountability system as well as national certification that the Board of Regents requires?
I believe that is correct, but it is correct that they do have to go through our teacher prep accountability system that we oversee, just like our universities that are 4-year.
Thank you.
Dr. Davis, beyond that, I mean, it's just an effort to meet demand. I mean, we were greeted this morning by several members of the College of Education throughout the state. We had great conversations. We're thankful that they are here. But the numbers of students who are even going into their programs, you know, they are trying to work hard to increase their enrollment, but that enrollment's not there. So any other opportunities where we can have processes to transition individuals, particularly mid-career individuals, into the education profession is certainly warranted. And whenever we look at some of these requests that are coming from some of our larger urban systems, I know TeachGADO exists. Ascension has a program. Jefferson has an initial program that's actually built on a model that's been in place for a couple of years that they're finally extending into an actual certification program. So I think it's just an effort to use every means necessary to meet the incredible demand right now.
Well, and I absolutely can appreciate that we need more teachers in the classroom, but when talking about bodies, as we're thinking about these 4-year universities, as we continue to proliferate alternative pathways for them, one of the reasons they have fewer bodies in their classrooms at 4-year universities is because we have created all of these alternative pathways. And so until we figure out as a state how to encourage our students leaving high school, you know, to enter education and go through these 4-year universities, I think our 4-year universities are going to struggle to continue to provide excellent, you know, certified teachers for the state. And so I know we are focusing on that, you know, with scholarships and pieces of legislation trying to help address that issue. But thank you.
Any other comments? Thank you. Are there any comment cards? No comment card? Board members, do you have any objections? Hearing none, motion passes. What's our next item?
Next item is on page 35, item 4.1, consideration of revisions to Bulletin 746, Louisiana Standards for State Certification of School Personnel regarding teacher certification requirements and technical edits. LD recommendation is to approve as a notice of intent revisions to Bulletin 746 as outlined. An updated backup has been distributed.
Board members, a motion to approve by Ms. Holloway and a second by Mr. Garvey. Dr. Brumley, does the department have a presentation on this one?
No presentation. Basically, we are aligning some of the tests with some of the new ETS tests, as well as adding an opportunity for a geometry add-on certification. And so this is essentially what these revisions accomplish.
Do we have any comment cards? Board members, do you have any questions? Dr. Brumley, this, I was thinking about this on the last item, but a university official came up to me recently and was talking about the struggle with Praxis 2, and that sometimes when they recruit candidates in, they start them in the process, but when it comes to passing the Praxis 2 hurdle, some of them aren't able to make it through, which is when they start selecting other routes into the teaching profession. And so I'm just curious if you guys have discussed that as a department. I know you've got a number of things going on, but I'm wondering if you have that conversation, and if so, where you get with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing conversation. I think it's potentially not just the department and the conversations we're having around it, but it's an item that they're taking up in the teacher recruitment and retention task force, which I believe Ms. Holloway is a member of that task force. And so that is one of the many items that group is exploring, not just the core content at hand, but also potential entrance barriers that might exist as a result of practice, the first practice. So those are things that are happening in that retention and recruitment task force.
Okay, so the conversations are happening, and at some point we might discuss it as a board.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Morris?
I did have one question with regard to the geometry item. adopt the geometry practice exam. As I understand it, maybe 50% or so of the schools in the state, high schools in the state now, offer physics and calculus, which is obviously a direct requirement for our engineering career pathway. And then Algebra 1 and geometry are prerequisites to those two courses. And also understand there's a direct relationship between passing geometry and improved ACT scores. And so therefore that leads to where we get the educator resources to teach geometry. And I think this item addresses that to some extent. But my understanding is that as it's posed right now, if I'm already teaching 6th grade math, but I've got an interest and a passion to teach high school geometry, then I've got to pass the praxis for all of the high school math curriculum, which is quite extensive. If the board approves this measure, then it would provide an opportunity for me as a 6th grade math teacher to teach that geometry class if I could pass the geometry exam. But it also requires a prerequisite to have already passed the Algebra 1 exam. So my question is, why is there a prerequisite to pass the Algebra 1 practice exam if I'm just going to teach geometry?
So that's a good question. I think it's a relevant question considering that there is legislation taking place right now that could potentially make geometry a required course for every student in the state of Louisiana. So there will be the need for additional geometry courses across the state. And so if we're speaking directly to geometry here, this geometry item would add a standalone geometry certificate, or endorsement rather, but the individual would have to pass the secondary principles of learning and teaching. They would have to pass the Algebra 1 content, and they would have to pass the geometry content. So what you are raising, I think, is a really good question, which would be, should someone have to pass the Algebra 1 test to be endorsed in geometry? That is something that was brought through some of the advisory groups on this particular item, which includes the Louisiana Association of Teachers of Math, as well as the school personnel administrators group. So I think that there would be an opportunity to consider whether or not the Algebra 1 was a necessary test that someone should have to pass. I think that what you are considering is, if a person can pass the core test in geometry, should that be enough to simply teach geometry? And I think that's a worthy conversation.
Okay. So how do we pursue that?
Well, as written, in order for the geometry endorsement to go into effect, the teacher would be certified, would have passed the secondary PLT, would have to pass the Algebra 1 content exam, and would have to pass the geometry exam. Procedurally, I would assume that you would simply adjust this recommendation to remove Algebra 1 as a requirement to be certified for the geometry endorsement. And is that accurate, Christy? Well, Christy Bloom's certification is here, so I want to make sure that I'm not missing something technical on that.
Christy Bloom, Director of Certification. Currently, the Algebra 1 endorsement requires an educator to have the middle school math exam, and they can either take that middle school PLT or the high school PLT to get the Algebra 1 exam, to get the Algebra 1 endorsement. They can take the Algebra 1 exam. The geometry is just building on that, so Dr. Lundy is correct. They would, after they've added that Algebra 1 endorsement, they would take the geometry exam.
I don't know if other members have some comments, but from my experience, there is a significant amount of algebra. Math is a building block education, right? So there is some algebra required to teach geometry, right? But all of the algebra starting out for 1 is not required in geometry. So my thought is, if I'm going to teach geometry and I can pass the geometry praxis, then that should be sufficient. I don't need to know 100% or be able to teach 100% of Algebra 1. And I wouldn't be qualified to teach Algebra 1 if I pass the geometry praxis. I'd just be qualified to teach geometry.
Any other questions or comments? Is there any opposition?
Well, I don't have opposition. I'd like to make a change so that the Algebra 1 component is not required to teach geometry.
Is that a change you would like to put into a motion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so I'm sorry. I'd like to offer a motion that Algebra 1 certification is not required to teach geometry.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Dr. Brumley, I have a question about whether, I'm sure we have a committee that considers these things. Did that committee have this specific conversation?
Yeah, I think it comes from conversations with the Association of Teachers of Math, and that is where a lot of the conversation came from. There was a belief that algebra might, that a teacher might need to pass the Algebra 1 test in order to receive the geometry, the opportunity to teach geometry. What I think is a question here is, if we are adding a geometry endorsement only, should someone who simply can pass the geometry test, would they have the content knowledge to be able to teach geometry? It seems to me like they probably would, but there is some reason evidently why the Math Council felt like Algebra 1 needed to also be a passed assessment in order to get the geometry endorsement. If the board would like, and if it works for Mr. Morris, one thing that we could do maybe is not a compromise position, but another alternative could be we could pass the edits excluding this item, and we could go back to that group and ask them, would they be comfortable with removing the requirement that someone would also have to pass the algebra test to take and pass the geometry test to be certified?
What would be the timeline to do something like that? I think that would be of interest to Mr. Morris. Okay, I'll go to Mr. Garvey next. What would be the timeline?
I mean, that could happen relatively quickly. I mean, I think with him bringing up the comment, I mean, I think it is worthy of additional conversation, especially considering that legislation that is working its way through.
Okay. Mr. Garvey?
Yes, I would also like to know, thank you, if we could have a representative from that committee, whichever it is, come to our next BESI meeting and have a conversation with us about this issue.
Yeah, that's absolutely, well, I don't know how to handle it with Mr. Morris having a motion on the floor around this, but we are happy to go back to these two groups around this particular geometry endorsement, have additional conversations, and come back with a recommendation at the next BESI meeting.
Mr. Morris, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to pull the motion and we can follow up. Again, my interest is just to make sure that we don't put any unnecessary hurdles in the way of folks that are interested in teaching geometry.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. What action do we need to take for you all?
Dr. Bovee?
Yes.
That organization was supposed to be here today. We could pass it. One suggestion is we could pass this, as Mr. Morris has clarified, and then they could come back and we could put it as a read for tomorrow, and then they could come and let us know their thoughts tomorrow before we went through the notice of intent process and, got halted, and then we could proceed if y'all felt comfortable. How does that sound?
I think Mr. Morris would appreciate that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's fine with me. Thank you for your comments. So that it's really up to other board members.
If that's the way y'all wanted to go.
Again, my interest is just to make sure that we've got to focus on this. We don't put any unnecessary hurdles in the way of professionals that want to teach geometry, given the need, and again, relative to Superintendent Romney's comments, the item in the legislation, it's going to be proposed legislation today, is going to add more geometry classes. So just anticipating that's going to get passed, there's going to be more demand, and we want to be able to meet that demand.
Yes, Ms. Holloway?
The only concern I would have, Ms. Davis, is the turnaround of them being here tomorrow. Is that such short notice for them to collaborate as an association to have an answer?
If I may, we met with the LATM leadership, and their intention was originally to join today. I don't see them in the crowd. I can reach out to them and see if they would be available tomorrow. Be happy to do that.
And if they're not, we can then proceed. But they were pretty, I will say, they were pretty avid about this recommendation to pass the algebra as well as the geometry, because there was so, I'm speaking from what I recall, because this conversation has been going on pre-COVID, and they felt very strongly that this Algebra 1 practice was needed because there's so much Algebra 1 embedded in the geometry coursework, as well as in the ACT. And so they thought that the two together would be a better fit. If you're not going to make them know all, be able to pass all the maths, those two are the critical ones for that certification.
They also mentioned their concern about not enough algebra on the geometry exam to get those higher level geometry students to, that excellent score on the geometry exam, EOC 822.
Dr. Brumley, do you have?
Yeah, I just think I appreciate what Ms. Davis is trying to do in terms of efficiency, but I think if we're going to have additional conversations, that's going to be difficult for me to do. I mean, we're in meetings all day today, so I have no time, and then they're back in the morning, so that's just going to take me additional time.
I agree. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Morris?
I'm happy to pull the motion to follow. Thank you.
Okay, so then he pulled his motion, so we'll be voting on the motion as it was originally read. All right? No, I think we can move forward with what we have. I'm gonna say that we'll move forward with what we already have, and then the superintendent, if there's any edits that need to be made between today and tomorrow, we'll have another opportunity tomorrow, and then the superintendent will be looking at additional engagement on this particular issue. I'm assuming by the next meeting.
Right, the only concern I have, and maybe you have a process for how you want to handle that, but everything else is good to go. If you approve the policy as is, it would approve the geometry that would require the algebra. So I don't know if you want a motion that is excluding that particular item.
Question?
Yes, Mr. Castillo?
I would move that we pass item excluding this particular reference to geometry and ask that it be placed on next regular meeting agenda for further consideration.
Okay, and is there a second? And I got a second by Mr. Rock. I heard something on this end. Do you guys have anything to say?
Yes. Would that delay cause any problems for summer certification courses or anything that teachers might be taking this summer in order to prepare for next school year?
I mean, this is simply an additional opportunity. I think the only thing that it would do would be if you had an individual that already had the Algebra 1 that just wanted to go and take the geometry and earn the endorsement, it could impact that person. That would be, as far as I know, the only impact. But what we are essentially talking about is coming back with a policy that's less restrictive, not more, because they would only be required to maybe take one test, not the two.
So you're not concerned about the motion that's currently on the table?
I am not. I mean,
Okay.
I feel like we need to probably have more conversations with that math council. That will take some time, but I also know these other tests have shifted, and so we need to make the shifts on these particular tests exclusive or not including the geometry.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we have a motion on the table that moves all of this forward, all of the department's recommendations, except for that one piece that we've been discussing. And that piece will come back before our committee in June. Board members, do you have any opposition to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes. What's our next item?
The next item is on page 43, item 4.2, consideration of revisions to Bulletin 746, Louisiana Standards for State Certification of School Personnel regarding mentor-teacher waivers for the 2022-2023 school year. The LDE recommendation is to approve as a notice of intent revisions to Bulletin 746.
Do I have a motion? Thank you, Mr. Mellerin, second by Mr. Garvey. Superintendent, would you like to speak to this item?
I think this is, I know it's asking for another waiver around mentors, but it's actually also an opportunity to celebrate a bit. Just giving you a few numbers, in August of 2021, we had 915 credentialed mentors in the state, 915. As of March of this year, we now have over 1,500 credentialed mentors. So that is a point of celebration. I think that is good work. But the reason we're asking for the waiver is because in some geographical areas and in some subjects, we still don't have enough mentors. And so this would allow us to continue to, on a case-by-case basis, handle this. Also would point out that with the MFP resolution that this board sent to the legislature, there's a $2,000 incentive supplement for individuals who will be mentors moving forward if the legislature passes the MFP. So we are asking for this waiver, but at the same time, there's a lot of work we're celebrating because we are up about 600 mentors over the course of the year.
So I'll say this one is extremely important to me, and I just appreciate this process because it's one that doesn't give up on our aspiration. But we are already seeing success through this process. So I would struggle if we were talking about a waiver for the sake of a waiver and didn't have the growth that we've had in place. But I just want to congratulate you, Superintendent Brumley, and the department, and those of the people working in the field to make this possible and for us to have the growth that we've had in place. Board members, do we have any comment cards on this one? No. Board members, do you have any questions or comments? Mr. Morris.
Dr. Brown, you mentioned that there are currently 1,500, but we haven't achieved our goal yet. What is our goal?
Well, it would be a mentor for every new teacher that needs one. We can certainly go back in and look at what that number might be. But for now, we have just been struggling for a while, even prior to the pandemic, we've been struggling to have enough mentors to service the need. And no one can tell you more than our university providers here. So that is a number we can look towards to get a better idea of what that number might ultimately be.
And I think if you look at the backup on page 46, it shows you a breakdown of certification areas and shows just how complex this process is that we're not looking to have a mentor just for the sake of being a mentor, but someone who in that content area is able to support a new teacher. And so you're going to see fluctuations from year to year based on what your vacancies look like.
I'm just trying to get a feel for, are we halfway there, or 3/4 of the way there, or, appreciate the progress, no doubt about it. Just trying to get a sense of where we are on that pathway.
So the last number I heard for vacancies, Dr. Brumley, was 2,500. Is that correct?
We presently believe we have 2,520 teachers. Well, we believe we presently have 2,520 certificated vacancies in school systems throughout the state. That's based on a survey and some estimations that we've utilized.
Right. So a little more than halfway there? Mr.
Yeah.
Morris? I'm talking to Mr. Morris.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So no comment cards, no questions or objections on this item? Hearing none, motion passes. What's our next item?
Your next item is on page 66, item 6.1, consideration of executive session regarding discussion of the character, professional competence, or physical or mental health of a person. The recommendation is to convene executive session to discuss Mr. Donald Ray Scott Jr.
We're gonna pause for just a second. Oh, we can do that part and then I'll pause after you do that. So, can I get a motion to go into executive session? Okay, so I have a motion by Ms. Holloway and a second by Mr. Garvey.
Question?
Yes.
What happened to Mr. Cleo Jones? Did he?
It was consent, that was put on the agenda by accident. She was consent.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any public comment or board discussion on the matter before we take the roll call vote? No? In order for this motion to pass, 2/3 affirmative vote of members present is required. May I have a roll call vote?
Yes. Dr. Brophy?
Yes.
Mr. Castillo?
Yes.
Ms. Davis? I'm sorry, Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis is not present. Mr. Garvey?
Yes.
Ms. Holloway?
Yes.
Mr. Mellering?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Orange Jones is not present. Mr. Rock?
Yes.
Ms. Oche is not present. Ms. Ellis, not present. You have four. I'm sorry. Motion passed.
Thank you. I'm going to pause now and turn the mic over to Superintendent Brumley to introduce some of our guests in the audience.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment. I saw the scholars in the audience and try to get some background on the opportunity to introduce these young learners. And as I understand, Dr. Monica, these students are from New Roads, who are part of a homeschool known as Star Academy. Is that right?
John Robert Lewis, also called for Star Academy.
Okay. So just wanted to take a moment to welcome these scholars to Bessie today and say thank you for being here to learn more about how school happens in the state of Louisiana. And so you have a front row or second row or even a third row seat today, literally, to some really important decisions to make sure that kids get a great education in the state of Louisiana. And I am glad that you are here. And if we can ever help any of you with anything, you let us know. But I believe your future is going to be bright, particularly if you keep trying to expand your learning with opportunities like this today. So thank you all for being here all the way from New Roads.
You are a very well-behaved group. I'm very proud of you. I will advise the audience that we will be in executive session for the length of time necessary for the discussion. No votes will be taken while the committee is in executive session. All votes will be made in public. Additionally, public discourse is not required of matters discussed in a properly held executive session. At this time, the Educator Effectiveness Committee meeting stands in recess to go into executive session.
I'll take 5.
May I get a motion to reconvene the Educator Effectiveness Committee meeting and continue with the regular order of the agenda to vote on the items discussed in executive session? I believe I heard a motion from Mr. Castile, and I have a second from Mr. Morris. Would you read the item, please?
Well, we've got it. Your next item is on page 77, item 6.3, consideration of a records review regarding the reinstatement of Louisiana teaching certificate appropriate to the credentials of Mr. Donald Ray Scott Jr. The recommendation is to grant, deny, or defer.
May I get a motion? I have a motion by Mr. Rock to grant. Do I have a second? A second by Mr. Garvey. Is there any opposition? Hearing none, motion passes. What's our next item, please?
That concludes the agenda.
Thank you very much. Who is chairing academic goals? Mr. Mellor, what time can we start?
You'll need 5 minutes, 10 minutes? 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Thank you very much.